World War II was one of the darkest times in human history. During this time, humanity strived to create weapons that would annihilate their enemies. But as time went on and desperation grew, morals were thrown aside and the value of human life became cheap. This phenomenon gave rise to an insane strategy called Kamikaze attacks. Hello, and welcome to our channel. Today, we are going to go into the dark history of kamikaze pilots. So let us begin. Now, let's start with the basics. What does the word kamikaze mean? Well, it is a Japanese word that means divine winds, and was originally used to refer to the typhoon that destroyed the Mongol fleet that prevented the second and last Mongol invasion of Japan back in 1281. Well, seems noble enough, right? Well, stick around to find out what this word actually entailed. Things weren't going Japan's way in the last years of World War II. When compared to the Allied forces, the Japanese military was vastly inferior. Their talented pilots had been lost in great numbers over the conflict, and their air force was no longer as strong as it once was. Japan was aware that they couldn't keep up, especially given the better finance and training provided to American pilots, as well as the more potent aircraft employed by the Allies. Those differences quickly began to show their true nasty selves. Military authorities began to increase recruitment and induct previously exempt university students into the battle. But it wasn't enough. New strategies were being discussed as early as the fall of 1943, but Japan had to act when it was unable to block the advance across the Pacific in 1944. As a last-ditch effort, the Tokotai unit was formed. This only served to highlight how dire the situation really was, as these were the units designed to conduct suicide missions. The Japanese military, in an effort to overcome its limitations at any cost, found one last line of defense against the Allies that it would use right up until the end of the war. The Japanese initially used kamikaze aircraft on American warships on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. This would prove expensive for both parties. Suicide bombers were used to attack the American fleet at Leyte, a Philippine island, after conventional naval and aviation combat failed to halt the American onslaught. I sincerely feel that the only way to tilt the conflict in our favor is to resort to crash dive strikes with our planes, declared Japanese naval captain Motoharu Okamura. He believed that many young men would be thrilled at this opportunity to save their country. In reality, 24 volunteer pilots from Japan's 201st Navy Air Group made up the first kamikaze force. The targets were American escort carriers. St. Lo was one among them, and was sunk in less than an hour after being hit by an A6M0 aircraft, killing 100 Americans. The special attack troops were developed with a simple objective in mind: to cause the most destruction at the least financial and human expense. Thus, there were new vehicles made specifically to serve this purpose. The small suicide crash boats were almost entirely built of wood, and were designed to sink ships right off the coast. It was operated by just one person, and had an outdated Toyota motor. With all that additional room and funds, explosives were loaded onto the yacht. Additionally, the kamikaze pilots were given specialized aircraft known as Oka, cherry blossom. In essence, these were little gliders, with a ton of explosives jammed up their noses. They didn't have anything extra, and instead of flying off on their own, they were even attached to the bottom of a larger plane by wood rather than metal. After all, it wasn't required to be powerful. They weren't particularly quick or even maneuverable, but they were effective. Their effectiveness would be seen in the Battle of Okinawa, a tough 82-day operation involving more than 130,000 Japanese and 287,000 US soldiers. More than 90,000 soldiers from both sides were killed in what was regarded as the Pacific Theater's deadliest fight, and there were also nearly 100,000 losses among the civilian population. Kamikazes killed nearly 5,000 soldiers during this combat, causing the worst damage the US Navy had ever experienced in a single engagement. Throughout the whole conflict, kamikazes sank 34 ships and damaged hundreds more. So, what sort of training did these kamikaze pilots receive? There is a common misconception that the kamikaze pilots were inexperienced and that Japan only required bodies to crash planes into ships. To be completely honest, there is some truth to it. The military started to choose kamikaze pilots from people who had only completed a portion of their training. The second phase of the aviation training course had been completely eliminated by 1945, as the Japanese were desperate for more manpower. However, this doesn't mean that these pilots were completely untrained. However, they gained nothing. The training they received was simply different and more applicable. When all was said and done, a kamikaze mission was unlike any other type of flight. Since they would frequently be dropped from a great height, they had to be prepared to deal with unusual circumstances, such as the effects of gravity. Usually, pilots are not supposed to dive bomb ships. Rather, they are supposed to take the plane in the opposite direction. Now, you may be wondering, how could anyone say yes to a suicide mission like this? Well, there are two sides to this story. Some pilots felt honored to be selected to sacrifice their lives for their country. For example, Hajime Fuji volunteered to be a kamikaze pilot, but his request was denied since he had a wife and was a father to two. So, to honor his wish, his wife drowned their children and then drowned herself so that he could get a chance to become a kamikaze pilot. Then, while making the second request, Hajime cut his pinky finger and signed the document with his own blood. This time, the petition was accepted, and Hajime flew to his death on the 28th of May, 1945. But this wasn't always the case. Soldiers were often taken to a room where they had to decide if they wanted to volunteer, abstain, or let their commander decide. According to some other accounts, the pilots were sometimes gathered in big groups and asked to volunteer. It may initially sound democratic, and in all honesty, that was the intention. However, eventually, the reality of free will was only a facade. By working in large groups, they were able to coerce everyone to volunteer, and even when given 3 options, most of the men intuitively recognized which one was the correct one. The idea that those who dared to refuse would be hauled back and instructed to choose the correct answer was terrifying. The Japanese were desperate, but they still weren't dumb. Kamikaze pilots were allowed to come back to base if they did not find the right target or if the weather conditions didn't allow them to fly. This was all written in a manual that was kept in their cockpit. In the event of an aborted mission, the pilot was asked to not lose hope that they not waste their life lightly, and to not let petty emotions control them. They were then asked to come back to base so they could attack another day. However, this did not mean that they could keep on aborting missions. A pilot was shot after he made his 9th return. Most of the time, aborted missions were the result of faulty equipment. Like we mentioned earlier, the planes used in these attacks were stripped to their bare minimum, so sometimes the planes would suffer equipment failure and had to return to base. Plus, by the end of the war, old decommissioned planes had to be brought back, which meant that the chances of failure increased. In the end, all these attacks could not change the outcome of the war. The Allies were able to take over Japan, and to some, this signaled a return to normalcy, as they would not have to sacrifice their own lives for a lost cause. The end of the war affected Motoharu Okamura deeply. He was in charge of the kamikaze attacks, and the man killed himself as he just could not bear the guilt for sending so many young men to their death. After the Allies had taken over, they tried to discredit the kamikaze pilots as fanatics, and over time, the narrative changed, and the public began to look at them with indifference. So that's all the time we had for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and do hit that bell icon on your way out. We'll see you next time.